they would rather he was at liberty, if anything. They would rather he was out there doing his thing. He's no good to anyone stuck in Siberia. There was another conference in Prague, one of Lenin's conferences abroad in Prague, which was a really key one, and Stalin misses it, obviously, because he's in custody. And at this particular meeting in Prague is the sort of the formal beginnings of the Bolshevik Party. Of course, it had already existed, but this is when it was set in stone. So when Stalin is out in Siberia yet again, he does much of the same, sleeping around and being bored and getting really drunk and creating little silly feuds with other exiles that are out there and trying to dominate them in any little way he can, because that's what he does. And as I say, he's a CC member, so whenever he turns up, he will be like immediately one of the top faces of the Russian exiles that are out there in any given place. On this one, apparently they have picnics, quite a lot of picnics. They sort of push their luck with like the local gendarmes, like flying a red flag and stuff, and getting shouted at and just being a bit of a nuisance. A bit of like as I mentioned earlier, like a student type stuff. It's funny that you could be a killer and do silly student protest type things. But I guess that's just the way it was. He was ready to escape pretty quickly. I mean, but he ended up actually not escaping from this one because one, it wasn't actually too bad. He actually seemed to enjoy it a bit. He got his landlady pregnant. And by the time he was sort of in a position to actually escape, he only had like a few months left on his term. So he didn't actually bother escaping. He actually served the whole 2 years. And there was just no point escaping. But when he did, he knew the landlady that he'd been sleeping with was pregnant. And he just left that week's rent on the kitchen table and just left without saying anything. He never got back to her or anything. Never saw her. Yeah, that's the kind of guy he is now. Totally the kind of guy he is. Apparently the local police there were afraid of him. Like one time he shouted at them and dressed them down and they just became afraid of him. So his time there was just easy. Probably the easiest time he ever did. Yeah, so when he is finally free, he goes back to St. Petersburg and starts sharing some rooms with an old friend of his. And the old friend of his has got a girlfriend who's only 16 years old. She's like run away from school. And she's staying with him. And apparently she's really hot because Stalin just nicks her. Well, they suggest that there might be a menage a trois between them. But certainly Stalin start sleeping with her, and the Okhrana, who are still tailing him because he's still an important person to watch, their code name for her is Glamourpuss. I suppose she's what Nabokov would call Nymphette, but yeah, Stalin was sort of infatuated with her briefly for like a month or something. Yeah, and apparently thought about Glamourpuss from time to time throughout his life. Okay, he fairly soon he gets picked up again, arrested again. He gets it's just almost a silly game of arrest and escape. So yeah, in 1911 he gets arrested again. He gets sentenced to 5 years in Siberia, but it gets reduced to. He gets sentenced to 5 years in deep Siberia, and it gets commuted to 3 years in not too bad Siberia. So again, like, what's going on there? Read between the lines. There's something going on. Lots of his enemies have said you're getting too sweet of a deal for there not to be something going on. So by 1912, he's on the run again. He can just escape. He goes back to Tiflis. So he's been arrested and sent on exile and escaped just multiple times now. Just multiple times. Like I say, it is almost like a bit of an absurd game of arrest and escape. Yeah, it's almost too much to believe. But and whenever he is at large, he's always still being tailed, or they're trying to tail him. the spooks this is. He goes up to St. Petersburg and is writing articles. It's in this time, in about 1912, in St. Petersburg, that the newspaper Pravda is begun. Yeah, so this paper went on all throughout the Soviet period. It was their propaganda. It was like the state newspaper that everyone had to read, or we didn't have much choice. But at this stage, it was just, a really, really small outfit. It was one started, I think, by one of the guys that originally started it was Molotov, and Stalin turns up in St. Petersburg and just starts writing articles for Pravda, like from the first issue, I think, or from the first few issues anyway. And he meets Molotov for the first time, and Molotov's an interesting character because he's one of the very, 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 very few that survived his encounter with Stalin. Stalin went through a period of deliberately deliberately killing all old Bolsheviks. This is later. This is like during the show trials and the purges. And Molotov's pretty much one of the only exceptions. But there is evidence of that Stalin, right at the end of his life, in the year or two, a few months before his own death, was planning to have Molotov and Khrushchev and all the big players that ended up surviving Stalin. He was actually probably going to have them all done away with. It was just a matter of time. But Molotov is almost the sole exception to it. And they like each other. They both seem to genuinely like each other. Molotov looked up to Stalin. Stalin was, a CC member and older and a known killer. So you look up to him. Molotov looked up to him. So yeah, they meet for the first time. But Stalin quite quickly gets arrested again and sent to Siberia for 3 years. But this one's he's a master now of escaping. So this one's just one of the easiest ones he ever does. I think he's only there for like 38 days before he escapes. They send him to an exile camp that it's got like 2 working escape bureaus within the town that he's sent to. There's like a whole infrastructure for people to escape if you want to. If you've got a little bit of money for bribes and blah blah blah. So he's only there for like not long at all, 38 days I've heard someone say. And he's just planning. He escapes by boat mainly from this one, and he's just thinking about planning more bank robberies. It's just business as usual, I think the idea of him getting arrested is just not a big deal to him anymore. There's one, I can't remember which one of his arrests, I think it is one before this one, but there's one where they raid him, they're like smashing down the door and get in, and he's asleep. He sleeps in the day a lot and he's out by night. That's like the life of a revolutionary. And they're smashing down the door and he doesn't even get up. He just yells, "Let me sleep." Of course, they're not going to let him sleep. He's arrested. But you get the impression that this is now old hat to him. And the idea of being picked up or arrested is not really the end of the world in any way. So yeah, he escapes from there and he goes straight back to St. Petersburg, where he starts editing Pravda and just plunges straight back into the life of conspiratsia, and he's playing it all up in Pravda, like making it sound cool. And it's a bit later in 1912 that the Duma actually like gets up and running. And it's been up and running, but in 1912 6 Bolsheviks get elected to the Duma. So they've actually got 6 MPs, as it were. It's not quite like that, but yeah, which isn't that bad. It's not great, it's nothing massive, but 6 is all right, But here's the thing. 2 of those are Okrada moles within the Bolshevik Party. The Bolshevik Party is actually infested with moles, like police operatives. Yeah, so much so that even 2 out of the 6 leading dudes that actually got elected, and one of these guys is a guy called Roman Malenkovsky, and he really helps to set back the Bolshevik movement. It really helps to set back the whole revolutionary movement, and I'll be talking about him a bit more as we go along. But remember him, because he ends up becoming important. And again, he's not mentioned that often in most documentaries about, Lenin or Stalin. He might get mentioned, and but won't really stress how much I think what he ends up doing becomes as important as it is. It's at this time that Lenin himself moves to, for a while, to Krakow in Poland. And of course that's a lot closer to Russia than he's been for a while. And apparently he really loves Krakow, and he asked Stalin to come and visit him while Stalin is still at liberty. And Stalin just sleeps on his sofa. They decide that there's definitely going to be no working with the Mensheviks now from now on, which again they still vacillate on, especially Stalin. Stalin remains what they call a conciliator, which is just means whether you should have like reconciliations with the Mensheviks. Lenin believes that there should be absolutely no rapprochement with the Mensheviks. They cannot be worked with. They're just simply our enemies. That's what Lenin thinks. Stalin thinks, no, maybe we need all the help we can get right now. There's, maybe more power in, maybe more strength in unity. He's what they call a conciliator. And so they're at odds with each other. They disagree, really, on that point. And it's quite a big point. Yeah, and they don't really agree on it. And Stalin goes back to St. Petersburg, keeps working for Pravda, writing articles and stuff. And he writes the articles he wants to write, the ones that don't agree with what Lenin said. So Lenin sends him letters going, "Oh, what are you doing? Like you can't do this." And apparently Lenin even sends him articles that Lenin has written saying, "Print this." Like dozens of articles, and Stalin doesn't. Now that's bad. That's you're directly disobeying your boss, basically. So after a while, Lenin sends Stalin a letter, and it basically says, "I demand you come to Krakow right now. Like, drop everything. You've got no right to be doing what you're doing. I want to see you. Come to Krakow." No, I'm not taking no for an answer. So, not many people talk to Stalin like that. Even then, if anyone would, it would be Lenin. But because Lenin knows that Stalin is a killer, he's unlikely to kill Lenin. Lenin's like a sort of a world famous revolutionary, and Stalin's just one of his guys. But you don't know. Stalin is a nutter. He could quite easily order you killed. But anyway, Stalin does go back to Krakow for a second time, and it seems Stalin just Lenin turns the charm up on Stalin, just basically keeps him with him day and night, has breakfast, lunch and dinner with him, and just convinces him, just pulls him round, just relentlessly, always really nice to him, defeats him with niceness, does everything he possibly can to sort of smooth over their differences. Because Lenin's options and apparently he did consider expelling Stalin from the party entirely. He does move him away from Pravda. But yeah, he realises that he's too big of an asset to the party to get rid of him or anything like that. He needs him. So yeah, he just turns on a charm offensive and wins him round. Lenin does win that little struggle of wills, basically. Yeah, and from then on, it seems that Lenin and Stalin do really quite bond as well. It seems like it's, it's not just a marriage of convenience. It's not simply that I need you more than is worth getting rid of you. It seems like they did actually, because they did see eye to eye on nearly everything else politically. They were very, very close to each other on most stuff. So it seemed from this point on their bond was really strong. And that's sort of one of Stalin's dreams, when he was just a boy in the seminary in Tiflis. It was sort of his dream to even meet Lenin, let alone become one of his closest sort of intellectual, almost equals. They do say this thing though a fair bit. It comes up again and again, that if you ever disagree with Lenin or someone who's higher above you in the ranks of Marxism, if you ever disagree with them, they would say, "Oh, you haven't got a mature view of Marxism." So, for example, later Stalin disagrees with Lenin on a really minor point, and someone brings it up to Lenin and says, well, Stalin doesn't actually agree with you on that. And Lenin can just brush it off by saying, well, it's just one of his immaturities. It means you haven't really got a full view of what Marx said. Yeah, and this period of leaving Russia, this particular period of leaving Russia, ends up being the longest time Stalin ever spent abroad, because he goes on to Vienna and stays in Vienna for a while. Because what happens is, Lenin says one of the points they disagreed on was about... Oh, well, I won't go into the details of it because it is kind of boring, but their exact policy on nations. I told you socialism is meant to be like an international movement where all workers of the world should rise up and seize the means of production, etc., etc. But how does that work in a world with borders, with loads of countries? Like, even the Russian Empire, or as it came to be, the Soviet Union, you're still dealing with lots of different countries, and it's not practical or even really possible to just do away with all of that. For example, when Hungary became part of the Soviet sphere in the 50s, you can't just say Hungary doesn't exist anymore. We're all just socialists now. You can't really do that. It's difficult. So they needed some sort of policy. Again, I'm boring myself with this. They needed some sort of policy on how to deal with nations within a greater Soviet sphere. So Lenin says to Stalin, why don't you go to Vienna, where there's loads of other intellectuals there. Some are leading lights, like Bukharin and Trotsky and stuff. Go there, stay there for however long it takes, like a month or two or whatever, and write me an essay on it, and I want you to go and do that. Basically, don't go back and keep editing Pravda, because that's pissing me off. And Stalin agrees. It's still quite a prestigious thing to be asked to do. So he goes to Vienna. Stalin in Vienna. And at this time, there was somebody else living in Vienna at that exact time, Hitler. Hitler was living close as well, relatively close to where Stalin was staying. I mean, Hitler was living there indefinitely. That was his home, and Stalin was only visiting, but they were in the same city at the same time. It's one of those quirks of history that, or if you want to call it that Stalin and Hitler never met. Even when they had the Nazi-Soviet pact, it was Ribbentrop and Molotov. It wasn't Hitler and Stalin. That they never actually met each other. They were locked in the most titanic, colossal battle of total war that there's ever been, to the bitter end, and yet they never met. However, and this is a great little corner of history as far as I'm concerned, they did both like to take walks around the same park. There's a park that surrounds the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, and it's quite possible that they walked past each other, or it's highly unlikely, but sat on the same bench next to each other. Who knows? Who knows? Stalin had befriended another family in a safe house, and used to, completely innocently, like to take the daughter out, walk around this park and give her candy and stuff. Some people always like to talk about, if you could go back in history and kill Hitler, would you? That old thing. Or if you could go back in time and kill Genghis Khan or Stalin or Mao or somebody, would you? And stuff. I always think what would be quite cool is if you could go back in time, and as Hitler and Stalin were walking past each other in the Schönbrunn Park, take them out of a single bullet, a headshot goes through both their heads as they pass each other. Anyway, that's a bit of a crazy thought. But and they were both thinking about the question of race and ethnicity. Hitler, of course, was thinking about his ideas of racial purity, according to Mein Kampf, even this early on. Or it was actually during this period that he was first really becoming aware of how much he hated Jews, or how much he hated people, not just Jews, all peoples that weren't Germanic enough. So, Hitler's younger than Stalin, and his sort of intellectual journey was in a much earlier phase. But Stalin too was there. He was in Vienna to be writing an essay about nationalism, the nature of sort of National Socialism, not to put too fine a point on it. And of course their thinking couldn't be further apart in the end. But it's just fascinating to me that they might have walked past each other and went on to clash in the biggest land battles that have ever been. But while he's there in Vienna, Stalin also meets Trotsky sort of face to face, and Stalin instantly takes a dislike to him, just physically doesn't like the look of him, let alone what he's like. And they're both really arrogant egotists. It's rare that two big characters like that get on. Anyway, I mean, Trotsky was a lot more sort of civilized, you would say, and from Trotsky's side, he wrote that he just saw cold malice behind Stalin's eyes. Yeah, I think he sort of saw through him, really. He saw that he was, in fact, a bit of a monster. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. When Stalin finishes this essay, he goes back and shows it to Lenin, and Lenin's really happy with it. In fact, questions whether Stalin even wrote it himself, which is pretty patronising. But he really quite likes it and is happy to accept it as just party policy. And in fact, it is really a blueprint for the Soviet Union, of how the Soviet Union would swallow up states and things, or how it would deal with socialism in one country, etc., etc. So Lenin's really happy with it and says, "Okay, you go back to Petersburg and print it in Pravda." He gets the green light. So it basically seems that their troubles between them have been patched up mostly, and it is printed in 1913 in Pravda. And for the first time, it's printed under the name of K. Stalin. It's only the second time Stalin's ever used that name, but in the first time in Pravda, like K for Korba still. So yeah, 1913 is when Stalin really starts calling himself Stalin. An interesting name, I suppose. But St. Petersburg at this stage, 1913, we're getting close to World War I kicking off. People sort of know that World War I's coming. They've got no concept that it's going to be anywhere near as bad as it's going to be. But the idea that there's going to be a big conflagration between the major European powers has been in the offing for years. And by 1913, they don't know it's going to happen in August 1914, but it's coming, Mm-hmm. People feel like it's coming. And the authorities try and stamp down again a bit harder on revolutionary activities, and I've heard St. Petersburg at this period described as a bacchanalia of arrests, an orgy, basically just a mass of arrests, and it seems like the CC, the Bolshevik Central Committee, has been infiltrated again by the Okhrana, and nearly everyone gets arrested and sent off to Siberia, apart from Stalin again. Like, what's going on there? But only for a while. He actually only manages to stay at large for a little bit longer than the rest of the big boys. He does eventually actually get arrested. But this is a big one. This is a bit of a different ball game now. I mentioned a guy before, Malinovsky, he's the mole. He's the main Okhrana mole within the Bolsheviks, and he basically sets Stalin up. There's going to be this ball, or this like a formal do in St. Petersburg for like a lot of the party apparatchiks, and they say, you've got to be there. And so I was like, no, I haven't even got the clothes for it, and I don't want to. I know, like I've got good dress clothes I can give you, and he just makes him go, basically. Where he gets arrested. Some secret police turn up, and people try and surround Stalin and try and smuggle him out the back, and they put him in drag, but it doesn't work. He gets caught. Apart from anything, he's got a massive moustache by this point, so how the drag thing would have worked, I don't know. But he gets arrested, and now the authorities are not messing with him at all. They sentence him to 5 years in deep Siberia. And they do send him there as well. He's not getting out of it. He still thinks he is. As soon as he gets there, he writes a letter back to Lenin saying, "If you need me, I'll be there." He thinks it's like but it's not. They've changed the rules on him a bit. There's loads of different degrees of how bad Siberian exile can be. And before now, he's always got a sweet deal, a fairly sweet deal. If, as I will explain shortly, if you're really sent out there, you are cut off. There isn't an escape. There's no escape. You're not only cut off, but you may well die of the cold. So there's just a world of difference between some types of exile and others. Stalin doesn't, considering how experienced he is and savvy he is in general, it's surprising that he doesn't realise at first that he's actually in the shit now. He thinks this is just another, it might be further away, but it's just, it will take him longer to get back, but that's, no. The authorities crack down, and there's another thing, well, I'll explain it as we go along here, but they send him to... he actually gets sentenced to 4 years, not 5 years. But it's in the deepest, darkest Siberia, a place called Turkhansk. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. But it's like the Turkhansk province, and it's way out there. It's like... okay, so it's... Let me try and explain it. So it's night time for 9 months of the year. You're way up in the Arctic Circle, way up there. The sun only comes up for a few months of the or most of the day for most of the months of the year. It's dark, so that's something that screws with people. If you're not used to that can really mess with your mind a bit. But it also gets as cold as -60 in the winter, and is regularly -30, -40, like snowdrifts that are just off the charts, the deepest thing you've ever seen. That's just regular. There's hardly any people up there. There's only Tunguskan nomad that follow the reindeer herds around in the summer. The rivers get entirely frozen. In fact, it's even beyond sort of reindeer country almost. There's nothing up there. Someone described there was only Arctic foxes. That's the only wildlife and stuff. And on top of that, where you stay is just the simplest ramshackle huts. Or one time, someone was saying that one of the huts Stein had to stay in up there, the windows were broken. So there's just howling wind coming in. And it's -40 outside. And there's no escape. There's literally no escape. You couldn't leave if you wanted to. So that's a completely different kettle of fish. I've heard Turkhansk province described as an obscure Siberian realm of frozen twilights forgotten by civilization, and also an inconceivable remoteness and wild vastness. And Stalin, when he goes up there, fairly quickly though realises that this is a whole gear shift, and he actually gets ill. Not sure exactly with, but probably something like pneumonia or something. Again, he could have died so easily at this point, but he doesn't. But he gets really quite ill, and he's really poor. You still have to pay for your stuff out there, for food. And if you're not having money sent to you, you will starve to death. That's part of the punishment, that you've got to survive. And he's right on the raggedy edge. This is period, I think. He's the lowest ebb, really close to just dying. He's in an actual survival situation. He sends letters to everyone he possibly can, saying, kind of pathetic letters, saying, "Can you send me anything? Any rubles you've got, please? Can you send me anything you can? Because I'm dying here. I'm going down." And he doesn't escape, basically, from this. He is out in Siberia for years, nearly 4 years, and he suffers terribly.